Good day, folks. This is Dr. Lee Jones on the line with you. Here, let's talk about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a discussion of the key concepts of political science and what we said earlier. Remember, we started off our class saying that politics is about power. Power is the ability to influence choice, and the choices that matter are those that deal with the allocation of scarce resources. So then it makes sense that our discussion here will focus on a definition of power, power in its various forms. Let's take our charge. Let's take our responsibility from the organizer, Marcus Garvey, the Pan-Africanist organizer, Marcus Garvey. Recall with me that his influential book, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, in which Garvey says a reading man and woman is a ready man and woman, but a writing man and woman is exact. If you're going to be ready, then you've got to read your material. But if you're going to be exact, if you're going to be exact and scientific about how you answer the questions of the day, then you're going to have to do some writing. So taking that as our responsibility, as our charge, we've covered some ground in Chapter 2. In the Chapter 2 discussion, we said that a normative assessment is one that is concerned with the ethical valuations of a thing. You're looking to make value judgments about what things are occurring, and then you're looking at what should happen, what should have happened, what could have happened, right? Contrast that with the empirical mode of analysis. In empirical mode of analysis, you are concerned with that which is observable, and you are saying that the observable things, the things that you can observe, those are the factual things. Those are the things that truly matter. Putting your terms together, we then come up with a modality, a way of doing things that sounds like methodological empiricism. If empiricism is the way you observe things, then we're saying that methodological empiricism means that you are being systematic, scientific in how you observe empirical phenomena. And then epistemological empiricism, where epistemology is how you get to know things. It's the study of knowing. It's a study of the truth. Then we're saying that epistemological empiricism is, in one hand, how you get to know things, how you observe the truth. It's how you observe the truth. So using these terms, we're saying that we have an obligation to be clear-eyed about the empirical world and the questions therein. We say that politics is about power, and that power is the ability to influence choice. Power then is a defining element of political science. You know, a political scientist tends to have to take a more comprehensive view. If you're engaged in political analysis, you are by definition looking at the activities of human beings. Human beings are social creatures. So the political scientist then has to do some sociology. You have to do some economics. You have to do a taste of psychology, reading your Frantz Fanon. But power is the defining element of political science. Power affects how resources are distributed. Look at my example there. Think about what happened. Think about how quickly the Obama administration responded to the Yazidi people in Iraq, yet how slow the Obama administration responded to Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. Power affects how resources are distributed. Power also affects how groups and how individuals, the mechanisms that they use to pursue their interests. Look at that example there. And then power determines how countries interact with each other. The United States has nothing but words for Russia, for example, for Russia. However, the United States is bombing the bejesus, bombing the heck out of countries in the Middle East, Afghanistan, allowing the Saudis to bomb Yemen, bombing Libya, making raids all through northern Iraq, right? So why is the United States more likely to bomb a place like, let's say, Afghanistan, then the United States is less likely to bomb Russia when Russia in specific invaded the Ukraine and waged war against an erstwhile American ally. So power determines how countries interact. Power affects how groups and individuals pursue their interests, and power affects how resources are distributed. We say that the word power literally means the ability to affect something else. So power then is the ability to influence someone's activities in a way contrary, in a way opposite they were going to act before the power is enacted upon them. Power then is the ability to influence an outcome in order to achieve an objective. Power is the ability to influence choice. Another word for choice that you'll find in your textbook is the phrase volition. Volition means will. We know then that power is at work. We know that power is in effect when someone's volition, someone's choices have been affected. So the objective obtained must be one that is willed or desired by the primary actor, right? You're looking at your variables. If not, then that actor is not said to have power, okay? So let's look at some definitions and how we were walking our way into a discussion of power. Power can either be latent, we're talking broad generalizations, right? Talking about a foundation of how we think about the phrase power. Power can be either latent or power can be made manifest. Let's go with latent power. Latent power is visible where the mere possibility that the first agent will activate their power causes a certain amount of fear and a counter reaction in the second actor, who then changes their choices, changes their actions. Power is not even literally at work, but the mere threat of power, the mere possibility of power forces the secondary actor to change their activities. The example here is North Korea does not, their ideology, part of their ideology is to advocate for a unified Korean peninsula. North Korea, however, does not simply invade North Korea. Why? Because the American military since 1954 has policed the 38th parallel there, right? And so it's not like the United States is actively fighting and throwing bombs at North Korea. They're not actively using their military power, but their military power is evident in that they move the troops around and engage in war games with South Korea. So latent power. Manifest power is where the action of the primary variable causes the secondary variable to act in a way that the primary variable wants, right? Where the actions of one causes the other to act in a way that the first person wants to happen. I'm using the example about Russia and the Ukraine on the slide, but think about yourself as you're driving down the street. You're driving, then you look in your rearview mirror, you see the blue lights of law enforcement pulling you over. When you pull over, you have then been affected by the manifest power of the police to use the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution to impede your locomotion, to form a type of a search and seizure where your locomotion is being seized, right? A search and seizure in the supposition that, rather the probable cause that a crime, perhaps a traffic crime, has been committed. So manifest power and latent power are the two blunt forms of power. If an interest group causes a politician to act contrary to that politician's own volition, then this interest group is said to have power. If a country orders another country to do something that the second country wanted to do anyway, then the first country is not understood to have exhibited any power. So they're most often in actual political relationships. The types of power are not in isolation, but latent and manifest power wind up being blended together, right? And so what we're looking to do, if we're looking to turn our attention, put our political science lens on a form of power that we see in the empirical world, we wind up needing to think about things in their blended context. So power then is the ability to influence choice. The choices that matter are those that influence the allocation of scarce resources. So chapter 3, the main part of chapter 3 is a discussion of the types of force. So the types of power. So we'll discuss force as a form of power, exchange. Think about we'll think about the forms of power. So let's start here with force. When we talk about force, the question that you're likely to see on the test is to say that this is an exercise of power by physical means. When we talk about force, it can be violent or it can be non-violent. So force as a form of power can involve acts of physical obstruction, acts of physical violence, or it can be non-violent where the force is seen in a boycott, a march, a protest, a sit-in, or a strike. Okay, so in terms of the methods of force, right? If force is a form of power, we see the types of force explicit in, for example, the force of restraint, where law enforcement engages in some type of restraint of the citizenry. And we're talking about traffic stops. We're also talking about, and the next slide is about stop and frisk. Another form of force as a type of power is plainly an assault. And so an assault, what I'm looking to get across here is where you have a mass of protesters. I'm thinking about the early days of the George Floyd protest, May/June of 2020, right? Where you have massive amounts of protesters coming into contact with rather large and militarized forms of police forces. And if there's contact, if there's tear gassing and rubber bullets and pepper spray and batons at work and bricks being thrown and bottles being thrown, then that is a form of assault where the state is engaging in force to compel compliance on behalf of the citizenry. So some famous examples of this, thinking about the Stonewall riots of the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969 that politicized the LGBT movement into a political force. And then we're talking about recent urban uprisings, right, in Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, around the police murder of Freddie Gray. Another type of force that can be used as a form of power, unfortunately, is the assassination, where you have certain actors, certain personalities, certain humans that have, let's say, pushed against the power of the state in such that either the state or an actor doing something on behalf of the state has decided to aim the barrel of a gun and shoot that person, right? So we're talking about assassination as a type of force. Here I'm listing some of the more famous notable assassinations, right? There are people that advocate, for example, for the Pan-African interest of Black people around the world. And in the course of doing so, many of those heroes and sheroes have been flat out assassinated. So I would ask you to pause this recording and then just go and do a Google search. Just look at a Google search and look at, who was Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso? What was the contribution that Amilcar Cabral made? Premier Patrice Lumumba, what did the CIA have to do with his assassination? I want you to answer these questions, not in the context of this class, but in the context of your life. Who killed Malcolm X? Who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr.? Who assassinated JFK, right? Look at what the motivations of people like Byron De La Beckwith, right? Medgar Evers. Okay, so assassination is a type of force. Another type of force, and we're thinking nonviolent here, is an embargo or a boycott, where the people protesting an injustice use nonviolent forms to deny physical access to a particular resource, typically economic in nature. The most famous example of, relative to the civil rights movement is Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, and the resultant Montgomery bus boycott that lasted from 1955 through 1956. Examples of blockades are, a blockade is an example of physical force. And examples of that, you know, you can pick and choose which ones you want to think about from history. The ones that I always think about is the British blockade of Boston Harbor after the Boston Tea Party. And then the Kennedy administration engaging a blockade of Russian cargo ships in, you know, the blockade of Cuba as a result when the Russians had put nuclear missiles in Cuba 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Okay, so force is a type of power. Now, this recording happens in the backdrop of the George Floyd protests, right? With the Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality. So let's think about the New York City Police Department and how for a time span of 10 years, they engaged in an official policy of discrimination against Black and Latino, in particular youth, in the city called Stop and Frisk. In that 10-year time period between 2002 and 2012, the New York City Police Department engaged in 4 million stops, frisks, searches, and interrogations. 4 million in 10 years. I put some numbers down here just to get an idea of the sheer numbers we're talking about. Let's go to 2010, right? 2010, they stopped, let me put my glasses on so I can read it. 2010, they stopped 300,000 people, 300,000 Blacks, 190,000 Latinos, 55,000 whites. A large number of them were between the ages of 14 and 24. And guess what? The majority of those folks were just completely released after being harassed or stopped by the police, right? So 90% of the people in that 10-year time span were Black and Latino, and 88% of the people that are stopped were just flat out released. Now let's think about what was the effect. Why was this happening, okay? So law enforcement, their first explanation was these stops and frisks, they are there to stop gun violence. Okay, we can say clearly though that this policy did not reduce the number of people who were shot in New York City. In 2002, there were 1,892 victims of gunfire, and there were 97,000 police stops. Then stop and frisk comes into play. By 2011, you had 685,000 police stops, yet you still had 1,821 victims of gunplay in New York City. So you exponentially increase the number of police stops, but you only incrementally, you very, very low decrease in the victims of gunfire. And so guns are found in less than 0.2% of the stops that were done during that time period. And then we're able to say that other large cities experienced larger declines in their violent crime when they didn't engage in stopping and frisking the Black and Latino community. So then why would you do this? You do this to engage in, you do this to use power against a particular community, where force is a form of power. With force being a form of power, it raises a few questions for us. Let's engage the normative assessment, the normative technique that we spoke about earlier, and ask an ethical question about the use of force. Is it right? Does it comport with the democratic values of the day? Depending on the example, right? I just use stop and frisk. Is it correct for law enforcement to stop and frisk, what we just say, 4 million people, right? 4 million people in a 10-year time span, and you have to let 88% of them go because they didn't do anything. I have Martin Luther King Jr. pointing at you because remember, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, published in his book, Why We Can't Wait, Martin Luther King Jr. tells us that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. We are tied in the single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Martin Luther King Jr. then said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's one way you can use your normative assessment to raise ethical questions about force, about the use of force as a type of power. Now, let's think about persuasion as a type of power. By definition, persuasion is a non-physical form of power where one makes his desires known to the other over whom power is exercised. Sit on that for a second. Persuasion is a form of latent or implicit power where person A persuades person B by explaining person A's volition, okay? And then the actions of B is altered from his preferred course. So power then has been exercised over the second person, but the second person B has not been acted upon physically. B then has merely been presented with A's will and has consented to do what A wants him to do. That is persuasion as a form of latent power. This latent power or persuasion, excuse me, this is a major part of political analysis. You look at the activities of, let's say, for example, legislatures or court decisions. While, excuse me, Weber tells us that Weber tells us in his 1918 essay, Politics as Vocation, Weber tells us that the state is a relation of men forcing other men to do things through the use of violence, right? So violence might be implicit or in the background, but when legislatures, for example, make their decisions, when they engage in horse trading or when they engage in log rolling, right? They're not engaged in punching each other in the face or torturing each other, at least not physically. The speeches might be torture, but at least not physically. So they're engaged in debating and they're engaged in lobbying. This is a form of persuasion. Persuasion then means where one person spells out his volition and this produces a compliant response in the others. Let's think about some forms of persuasion. One we have here is the stop sign. This might be the easiest one to think about. You're driving down the street. Let's call it the middle of the night and you're a very remote part of planet Earth. And you come to a four-way intersection and there is no police officer, there is no camera, there's no electronics at all. All there is you, your brake pedal, and the stop sign. There's no one around. What are you going to do? You're going to stop. And why do you stop? Because well, one, you stop because you never know, you don't want to get hit. But you stop because you have been socialized by the latent power of the laws of the state to tell you what you should do, even though there's no one there to make you do it. The stop sign is a clear form of persuasion. Let's think about some other forms of persuasion, right? The Federalist Papers were a series of persuasive arguments published in newspapers after the American Revolution in order to persuade state legislatures that they should ratify the new Constitution, right? Authored by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and fourth president of the United States, the father of the US Constitution, James, and slaveholder, James Madison. Let's turn our attention to the 1889 book called How the Other Half Lived. This is a photo essay, a photo book that documents poverty amongst immigrant populations in New York. And these pictures here influenced Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive reforms of the early 20th century. Consider this picture of these men sleeping in this room. Look at this picture. How many men do you see? I like this picture. This picture is clear. What is their economic condition? If their economic condition, what is their social condition? That's a respect of their economic condition. And then, what does it smell like in this room, right? What do poor people eat? Beans. And what do beans do to your gastrointestinal system? It makes you expel certain gases. So what does that room smell like in there? Can this type of poverty be found in the United States? a land, what do you say, land with the streets are paved in gold and all of that stuff there, right? Look at that picture of those children sleeping in the street. What are their economic condition? What are their life choices? How is this stuff happening in the United States? These types of pictures made the United States, not just this book, right, but amongst other things, help the United States engage in the progressive era reforms. And by progressive era reforms, we're talking about the recall election, the use of propositions and initiatives and referenda to ask the American people to weigh in more deeply on the political issues of the day. The progressive era specifically says that poor people, or let's say rank and file normal American citizens, have enough enough political sense, enough political rationality to know what they should do without the wealthy people telling them what to do. So the progressive era movement says that wealthy people should not dominate politics. Rank and file American citizens should be able to speak to their political desires. Let's back up and let's look at some of the work of Gordon Parks, the civil rights photojournalist, the director, right? The artist who illustrated the plight of African Americans prior to and during the civil rights movement. And some of his pictures helped influence the development of laws, in particular the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Here is Gordon Parks's rendition of American Gothic, the backdrop of the flag. Let me see if I can do this. The look on the lady's face, right? Look at the backdrop of the American flag. Is this type of thing happening in America? What is this thing on her left side? That's a mop. What is this thing on her right side? Yeah, that's a broom. What do you do with mops and brooms? You clean stuff. Who cleans stuff? Maids. What is the economic condition of the maid? We can see it on her face that there is a certain amount of discontent. There's a certain amount of angst implicit in this, in this picture. I like that picture there, right? Let's do a few more, right? We're talking about the power of persuasion. Consider this picture: Black babies snuggled up in poverty with a white doll. Not only do these children have an economic and a social condition to deal with, but they're also going to have a psychological, a mental condition to deal with also. Look at these pictures of defiance and pride. On this side here, you see the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton, Catherine and Eldridge Cleaver, right? And then here you have Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X, who translated the messages of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, where Elijah Muhammad tells us in Message to the Black Man that history is most qualified to reward all research, where Malcolm X tells us in his Ballad or the Bullet speech, 1963, I believe, where he says we're going to have our rights as a human being by any means necessary. Politics of power as persuasion. Now, let's turn our attention to another form of power, and that's going to be manipulation, right? Manipulation is, again, a non-physical form of power where the agent exercising the power conceals even the very existence of that power from the target. Manipulation means that the person who wants to enact power over someone else is going to hide their intentions. They're going to conceal the aims to which they are exercising their power over somebody else. So the effort is to conceal the motivation. The volition of the primary actor is hidden, but it is very much present. This type of power, the power of manipulation, is based around the desire of the power seeker to disguise and cloak their will. The target of this power may not even know that they have been acted upon. And so that begs then the political question: how can you resist something if you don't even know that it exists? Look at this last paragraph here. What we know is that during the Nixon's, this is from his second run for president against McGovern, right? What we know is that the Nixon campaign had a particular friendly relationship with the Gallup and Harris polling firms. So when they would come for a debate that was conducted by these firms, the Nixon administration knew the questions that were going to be asked before, the actual debate. So they could come up with, and then what we also know is that they were suggesting questions to the moderators, the Nixon campaign was. So they'd be able to ask seriously damaging questions, and then they would come up with canned or prepared responses where the opposition, McGovern, would have to come up with a response on the spot. Now, why would they do this? They're doing this to make Nixon look good and better prepared in the minds of potential voters. The voter then is being manipulated by the Nixon campaign. The voter does not know. This is something that came out, decades later. The voter doesn't know that the Nixon campaign has a relationship with the polling firm, and they're being, given the questions and the results of polls before they're published so that they could respond to them, right? You didn't know that as a voter. So the primary actor is the Nixon campaign hiding, cloaking their power to manipulate the voter. Power as manipulation. Now, let's turn our attention to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was deeply engaged in the Algerian movement for independence against the French colonizers. As a result of his work, we have some good books by Frantz Fanon. If you ever want to just get some good high quality reading on. Again, this recording is happening in the backdrop of the George Floyd protests right outside there, right? If you really want to engage in some racial reconciliation work, if you really want to get to know the nature of the psychological damage that racism does on, in particular, Black minds, but also the minds of white people that are affected just as well. You want to read books like Black Skin, White Mass, and then you also want to engage Frantz Fanon's 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth. Read this with me. Let's encapsulate a heck of a good book in just one paragraph. Frantz Fanon elucidates to us the concept of class suicide. Walk with me. The wealthy class that owns things have different and opposing interests to the poor people who, by definition of their poverty, do not own anything. That then means if a class is a group of people organized by their relationship to the means of production, then the wealthy people are part of one class, and then the poor people are part of a different class because they have different economic conditions. These classes are in conflict because Frantz Fanon clearly tells us that the French need the Algerians in order to build French wealth. So the wealthy needs the poor to survive. Wealthy people, because they know they need the poor, are then going to devise mechanisms by which they trick, they convince and manipulate poor people into believing and wanting things that make poor people poorer, while at the same time make rich people richer. So when the poor person believes and wants and does things that are in the best interest of the rich, while the rich are against the interest of the poor, then that poor person is acting against their own self-interest. For Frantz Fanon, when poor people act against their own economic interests for the economic interest of the wealthy, then that poor person is committing class suicide, acting against their own economic best interests. This, according to Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, is at the heart of the mechanism of colonization. This is how the French and by extension, the British and the Germans and the Belgians and the Portuguese, how the European is able to go around the world, extract wealth from other places, and then convince, manipulate, right? Use the form of power, which is called manipulation, to convince the poor people of these, the people of color that they're impacting, that the things that they want are good for them when they are in fact not. Last form of power we're going to talk about is exchange as a form of power. Exchange as a form of power. This, by definition, involves an incentive that one agent gives another variable an item in return for another item. Remember, an independent variable is something that acts on something else, and a dependent variable has been acted upon by something else, right? And so exchange is a form of power because the independent variable is able to give, or at least promise to give, the dependent variable something so that the dependent variable does what the primary actor wants done, right? So power is exercised in this way by giving the second agent, the dependent variable, the second agent an incentive to concur with the first agent's will. The second person does what the first person wants. The dependent variable acts in a way that the independent variable wishes because they know that such concurrence will be rewarded, okay? I have just hit the wrong button. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. So power is thus exercised because the second only acts after being influenced by something that's going to be given, right? So some blunt forms of exchange as a form of power could be the vote. Citizens vote in the hopes that they're going to elect someone to office that's going to do something that benefits the voter. A bribe is a form of an exchange because someone does something or gives something in the promise of a financial reward. They ask a person, where did you buy these drugs from? And, you know, the person who buys the drugs says, I got the drugs from this particular house, in the hopes that, for example, the police, for example, maybe they lessen or don't charge the primary person who bought the drugs, right? The person who snitched, right? The person who gave the, who accepting the bribe. All right. And then log rolling is a form of exchange, is power as a form of exchange, where legislators promise to vote on a piece of legislation, on a bill, in the hopes that their vote will be rewarded by favor when they have their own bills up for debate, right? So legislators vote in the promise of having votes for their favorite bills returned for their vote. Now, let's pay some attention to the 2007 book written by Naomi Klein. This is a heck of a good book, and this is called The Shock Doctrine, right? What Naomi Klein is concerned with here is looking at how the economic relationships of the world along the lines of neoliberal capitalism have negatively impacted people of color around the world, right? How European capitalism has negatively impacted other places on planet Earth. And she says this is happening because neoliberal actors, states that have economic problems like to, you know, they need money, they need a large influx of money. So they go to international agencies, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, for example, right, the World Trade Organization. They go to these agencies to try to get loans. And these international actors, infused with an ideology of neoliberal capitalism, what they look to do then is engage in the economic restructuring of the economy that wants the loan. And this restructuring is to then there to extract wealth from the state receiving the loan, and then the wealth goes to the large-scale multinational corporations that enrich the the economies of the West. Read this with me. Naomi Klein, she acknowledges that Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, that his libertarian free market policies were adopted by both the Ronald Reagan and the George W. Bush 41, the George W. Bush administrations, George H.W. Bush's administration. She's arguing that these libertarian free market economies are a series of exchanges which in the end analysis conspire to harm the economies of entire countries. Let's walk through the argument. These free market policies exploit the hope of poor people suffering economic difficulties. Poor people trust the government and comply with government policies in the hope that the government does things to make their lives better. That is a form of exchange. We're going to call that exchange one for our analysis. The government of the poor people is influenced by global actors. Some of them are successive American administrations. Remember, we said that Milton Friedman had an inroads, had FaceTime with Ronald Reagan and Bush 41. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. These are the global actors that have the ability to influence the social and economic policies of governments that want to receive loan monies. These global actors then cause local governments to alter their economies through a range of policies that Naomi Klein calls, and adequately, rightly calls, shock therapies in order to supposedly in order to better their economic situations. Why would these global actors engage in devaluing their economy, privatizing their local industries and the like? Why would they do this? In the hopes that the influx of the money, along with the structural adjustment programs, better their economic exchange. That then, for our analysis, is the second exchange. Why the states that need the money decide to do what the global actors want done. In fact, Naomi Klein is clear here. In fact, the shock therapy instead pushes the local economy into the service of the global economy, where the local poor economy serves to enrich large-scale multinational global actors, and the changes of the inside the local economy hurts the poorest people who, remember, in exchange one, they were putting their trust in the government in order to protect them, right? So if this happens across country after country, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, if it happens in country after country, in particular in South America, then the global economy then can be rightly understood as a series of crises and a series of shocks that serve ultimately to enrich the powerful and yet reproduce poverty on a global scale. That's what Naomi Klein here is arguing in the shock doctrine. And even if you don't read the book, there is a really good documentary on YouTube. I put the link down there. Maybe you just search for it and find it on YouTube if you can't click the link because you're watching the recording. Okay, I'm just about ready to end this recording here. Remember, we said that key concepts in political science, this chapter 3 is concerned with your understanding of power, but then also we want you to understand what a state is and then how a state is distinct from a nation, some modes of analysis, right? So we're going to say that a state is the primary actor in the anarchic world of global politics. Max Weber in 1918 tells us that a state is a specific type of political organization where the official institutions and society interact through the use of power. We're looking at the third variable. The official institutions control the means of coercion, and the second variable, where the official institutions monopolize rulemaking. If the state is let's write on the thing. If the state is a type of political organization, our question then is, what's politics again? Politics equals, all right, this might be the last time I try to write with this pointer here, but politics equals power. So if the state is a political organization, what in fact is being organized? Power is being organized. I believe these questions, this dialectic here, we're asking Max Weber some particular questions, and Weber is giving us some answers. I believe this stuff is pretty straightforward. I'm gonna leave most of this to you to read and sit on your own, right? So the most important agents of political decision making, we're going to say that they are the state. There are non-state actors at work in global politics, right? Multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations. But we're going to say that the state is the primary actor. And so there is some mechanisms that we could, rather some definitions that we could use to analyze state power. So please, let's do this. Please pay attention to the definition of sovereignty. You want to know that a failed state is one that has lost its ability to exercise sovereignty. So sovereignty is the ability of the state to be independent and monopolize rulemaking and provide security. States depend on legitimacy. States depend on the people of the state to give legitimacy to their government. Legitimacy is that the people agree that the state does have the right, the authority to tell them what to do, and then the people wind up actually following the rules of the government. One more time, I'm referencing the George Floyd protests because they're literally happening right outside right outside, right? And so the George Floyd protests, we're talking about dozens of American cities. We're talking about London, Tehran, Paris. We're talking about large scale protests happening all around the world along the lines of police brutality, along the lines of anti-racism work, along the lines of the state or the government abusing its power. So what we see here in these George Floyd protests is a crisis of legitimacy where people are questioning the authority of the police to tell them what they should do. Another way to analyze state power is to look at the culture of the place you're looking at, investigate the shared values of the citizenry, and then the cultural disposition of the citizens can influence the policies of the state. Okay, so along with the definition, a good specific Weberian definition of the state, we need a definition of what a nation is. So we're going to say that a nation is a unified group of people, with a shared identity that's based on common attributes, a unified group of people, right? Key components of the definition. You have unified, right? Shared identity. And then you have the phrase here, common attributes. What are those common attributes? Common language, the common religion, the cultural norms, the ethnicity, maybe even a broad topic such as race, okay? So once we have a definition of a nation, then we have a definition of the state. Let's compare the two, and then we'll conclude this recording of chapter 3. What's the key difference between the state and a nation, right? The key difference is that states are specific political organizations. States divide, allocate, redistribute power. What does a nation do? A nation speaks to the culture. It speaks to issues of identity. It speaks to people's loyalty to the place that they live in. And then when you use the phrase the nation, a nation involves the ability of the government to perhaps even manipulate the activities of the people that live in that place along the lines of social identity, political identity, right? So a nation can exist without ever forming a state. This is true. However, the primary actor that we'll pay our attention to is the state. All right, that's going to conclude our discussion of chapter 3 here. Be sure to, I didn't cover literally everything, right? So read the chapters and read those slides, and I'll see you again soon.